One of my favourite series of videos I've done on this channel is Space Race Speedrun. I recreated the entire US side of the space race, beginning with the humble Mercury Redstone, progressing to Mercury Atlas, Gemini, and of course, the legendary Saturn Apollo monsters. People seem to like the longer videos of mine, and so this week I thought I'd present Space Race Speedrun as one video, for you to witness the progression of the US's beginnings in space travel in a single sitting, I guess making it easier to compare the vehicles. I'm away this weekend unfortunately, hence no fresh new content, but I like to think my videos can be viewed more than once, and these came out a few years ago now, so I'm betting there's a lot of people that haven't seen them yet. I've also added new bits of commentary, and I've re-edited the start and end of each video so that they flow into one another seamlessly, so this shouldn't feel like 3 separate videos back to back, but one long video to enjoy. Just be aware there may be points where I say things like last week or next week when referring to earlier and later parts of this video, but that's it! Grab yourself a drink and some popcorn, and let's speedrun the space race. Speedrunning the space race. I guess that's a working title. I've probably come up with a better title for like the video that you're watching, so I'll put a thing on screen if I did think of something better. Maybe the dawn of the space race speedrun. Anyway, I should probably get on to what the actual thesis of this series is. Basically, I thought, you know, our history in spaceflight is very, very interesting, but it's also very long. You know, like for example, the Mercury program, which is the subject of today's video, was quite a lengthy job. Mercury program was the United States' first attempt at getting a man into Earth orbit. So it was the first set of manned space vehicles from the United States, and it involved them doing suborbital flights. Then finally there was an orbital flight, and it took a while to get there. So I thought, you know what? What if I did a series, you know, over the next few weeks, in which we talk about the key programs throughout the space race, so Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Voskhod, Vostok, Soyuz, kind of covering both sides of the Atlantic there, and sort of, but just for each episode, we just do everything from one program in one video. So my initial thought was maybe we just do every single Mercury mission, like objective for Mercury, in a single flight. I quickly realized that's probably not a great idea because there was 2 Mercury rockets, really. There was the Mercury Redstone and the Mercury Atlas. The Mercury Redstone tends to be the one people think of when they think of the Mercury rocket. I feel like it's the more iconic looking Mercury rocket. You might disagree, but that's just my perception of it. But the Mercury Redstone never went to orbit. It was only a suborbital rocket. It was the Mercury Atlas that actually went to orbit. So I thought we should probably do both rockets really to kind of commemorate Mercury. And then I thought, well, the first Mercury flight really was the Mercury Little Joe. And that was quite a big one as well, because there was a chimp on board for one of them. And it kind of tested the launch escape system. So that's what we're going to do. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the Mercury program. Did I kind of hit all the points I needed to hit in that intro? I think I did. Anyway, as you can see, I have been constructing a Mercury capsule on screen. The problem with Mercury is it's kind of a build of compromises in Kerbal Space Program. It's very hard to get the actual shape of the rocket exactly right. I mean, Kerbal Space Program does have a Mercury-like capsule. It's the first capsule you unlock, the one I'm using here. But the Mercury launch escape system is very hard to get right in Kerbal Space Program. And it's very hard to get the little retro rocket configuration underneath the heat shield looking okay as well. I feel like what I've got here is a good approximation of what the Mercury capsule looked like, but you know, it's not perfect, unfortunately. Now this could be solved with mods, especially something like Blue Dog Design Bureau, but I'm trying to keep this series stock. So if you're not opposed to using mods, then I do wholeheartedly recommend checking some out because you'll have a much easier time. But I'm working with what I've got here, and what I've got is a Mercury capsule, but we don't know if it's safe. We need to test the launch escape system. Enter our first of our 3 Mercury rockets we're going to be flying this video, the Mercury Little Joe. Little Joe was just a solid rocket booster. Looks pretty goofy. Looks like most people's first career mode rockets, in fact. It's only here to get us just off the pad so we can test the launch escape system. We're going to have Sam, the rhesus monkey, on board with us in spirit. He was the monkey that flew on Little Joe 2. Of course, there is no option to have rhesus monkeys fly things in Kerbal Space Program, so Jebediah is going to be piloting every single rocket we fly in this episode. What I'm also doing is setting up our abort sequence action groups that the launch escape system pulls the capsule away from the booster when we hit the abort action group, which I believe is delete on the keyboard, but it's also the big red abort button on screen just by the altitude gauge. But it looks like our first ever manned spaceship is ready for launch. So let's go to the launch pad and launch it. And here we go. We are off to a flying start. Was that a pun? I guess technically, but I'm not proud of it, put it that way. So yeah, Little Joe, a very goofy looking rocket, and we'll probably have to build more than one of these in this little series. Of course, one of them was for the Apollo module, which looked very fun. Anyway, we need to test the launch escape system. That's the purpose of the flight, so let's do that. Here we go. I wouldn't call it an amazing success because it didn't accelerate us faster than the rocket underneath it, but Jebediah is okay, is he not? So I would still call this a perfectly functional launch escape system that'll serve us well for the next of our Mercury flights. Now, one of the compromises I made with the launch escape tower that I've got here is that I wanted it to just be a single parachute on top of the capsule, much like the Mercury capsule. There was only one main chute on Mercury rather than having radial parachutes like a lot of people do when doing stock Mercury replicas. So that's why I kind of had that weird buffer. I don't know how to describe it. There's a bit of a gap between the parachute and the stack above it. Anyway, as you can see, Jebediah is back. He's fine. We're now going to construct the first of our proper rockets for Mercury. And that is, of course, going to be the Mercury Redstone rocket, which was the one that Alan Shepard flew into space, and in doing so became the first American to pass the Kármán line and become an astronaut, make it into space. So I think we can all agree that it's a pretty significant flight and it's a pretty significant rocket. Luckily, it's a pretty easy rocket to replicate in Kerbal Space Program. It's only single stage and it's not an SSTO because it doesn't reach orbit, and it's just a big stick with an engine at the bottom and some fins. So wasn't a particularly challenging build, hence why this part of the video was quite quick. In fact, we've pretty much finished the build. There it is. I know I have clipped the engine into a fuel tank, but that's an empty fuel tank. I'm just using it as kind of an aesthetic part to create a sort of makeshift shroud around the rocket. So don't worry, there is no clipping of things into fuel tanks. Anyway, oh my goodness, didn't this happen in real life when NASA were just apologizing about the design of their rocket whilst said rocket was launching on its historic flight? Probably not. Anyway, here is Jebediah flying my Mercury Redstone rocket, while on screen you can also see Alan Shepard flying Mercury Redstone when that happened in real life. So you can kind of see, hopefully I got the aesthetics of the mission, you know, at least somewhat similar to real life. Like I say, it was a pretty easy rocket to get the shape of. One side obviously figured out the ins and outs of trying to get the Mercury capsule looking fairly similar to its real life counterpart, and that kind of made the rocket a little bit difficult to fly, actually. That nose cone, well, the nose cone at the top of the launch escape system created a lot of drag, so all of my Mercury rockets were very, very flip happy. It was quite hard to keep them stable. So if you're going to try and fly this, try and hold it on the prograde marker as close as you can. And hopefully, by this point, like myself and like NASA, you'll have made it onto a suborbital trajectory. Now, Kerbal Space Program is obviously much, much easier than human space programs. So if you fly this very specific rocket, there is a chance, I think, I don't know, I haven't tested it, but it may have enough delta V to reach a stable orbit if you use that first stage and then this upper stage to circularize. However, that wouldn't be true to the mission. Mercury Redstone was a suborbital test of the capsule and the retro rockets. Yes, these rockets here, they're not designed to perform significant orbital maneuvers. They're only designed to deorbit the capsule, which I know means that they're not necessary on the Mercury Redstone mission, but it's important that we test them ahead of an actual orbital mission, because if they fail on a suborbital mission, it's no big deal. If they fail on an orbital mission, we're in a lot of trouble. So it's important that we test the retro rockets here, much like Alan Shepard did on his very famous Mercury Redstone flight that obviously made him the first American in space. And on my little test here of Lowne Aerospace's Mercury Speedrun, the retro rockets worked fine, so we know that we are now okay to do an orbital flight of the Mercury capsule. Like, I know in real life, again, there were a few intermediate stages, including another Joe mission, this time Big Joe, which featured the Atlas rocket, but I'm just trying to condense the program down. So we're going to now that we've splashed down, we're going to fast forward to the construction of the Mercury Atlas rocket, which of course was the rocket that put the very first American in a stable Earth orbit. And this was by far the most difficult Mercury mission to recreate in stock Kerbal Space Program. For one thing, the rocket is very difficult to build, and also the flight plan is quite awkward and difficult as well. So I'll cover both of those when we get to them. But I did some research beforehand to see if anyone else has done a Mercury Atlas rocket in stock KSP, and almost every YouTube video I could find got the flight profile incorrect. RSS users, I've noticed, especially Scott Manley's recreation, did get it right, but almost all of the stock recreations I could find got the flight profile wrong. We'll talk about that as we get to it. First thing I'm going to do is construct the rocket, which you can see me very awkwardly doing. Unfortunately, the Mercury Atlas rocket was very shiny stainless steel, which means I've got to kind of build it inside a fairing if I want to get the color scheme accurate. The other thing that made things very difficult was the staging of the Atlas rocket. Mercury Redstone was a single stage rocket, which of course, that's not enough to get to Earth orbit. But the Atlas rocket wasn't a 2-stage rocket, and it wasn't a 3-stage or 4-stage rocket either. It was a so-called 1.5-stage rocket. You see, at the time, they weren't sure if you could light an engine during flight, which means a conventionally staged rocket, like, I don't know, like your Saturn V, where you got the first stage, that gets you to so high, and then that whole thing falls away, all the fuel tanks and engines all drops away, and then a new stage with new engines, that lights up. They didn't know if they could do that or not. So the Atlas has 3 engines at the bottom of the stack that all light on launch, and they all draw from the same fuel tanks, and then at a certain point, about 2.5 minutes into the flight, 2 of the engines would just fall away. None of the fuel tanks would. So the only thing we're ditching are those 2 side-mounted engines there, and then we're going to leave the central skipper engine acting as the main engine. Or I guess, as NASA called it, the sustainer engine. We do have those very small engines mounted to the side of the booster as well, actually. Those just sort of help with our roll control and stuff, but they don't actually provide any level of meaningful thrust compared to the bottom 3. Now, the way in which the side-mounted engines detached was quite a difficult thing to engineer in Kerbal Space Program. Basically, you can kind of see how this works, right? It was just this entire shroud-like structure around the central sustainer engine, and attached to that was the 2 engines. And that whole thing would fall away as one single piece, sort of threading the engine bell of that central engine in a way. This is very, very, very difficult to do in Kerbal Space Program without something exploding. I was finding I was sort of having to make a compromise with either having an aesthetically perfect looking Atlas rocket, but I'd have to have the side engines radially decoupled, which is not that faithful to the Atlas design, but it means I can do a much more accurate recreation in terms of the aesthetics, or I have a less aesthetically accurate looking Atlas rocket, but one that stages a little bit more faithfully to the original. And I went with the latter. You know, I said earlier, a lot of the things I was doing when I was designing my Mercury rocket was trying to just make compromises, really. It was either perfect aesthetics, but compromising a little bit on the actual functionality of the rocket, or perfect function with imperfect aesthetics. And I hope that this is a kind of a nice enough balance. I know it's probably possible to strike both of those objectives perfectly. I know there are crazy people out there who are just much better at recreating things than I am, but I'm just working with my big dumb brain, and this is my big dumb solution. And there is my big dumb rocket launching away there, all of its engines firing as we start our ascent profile. Now, I mentioned earlier that every stock recreation that I saw, I must admit, I didn't do a very thorough search. There probably are videos out there that get it right, and I'm just now being very disrespectful to those hardworking players, but most of the popular ones that I saw didn't get the flight profile right. Do you remember how I said earlier that the reason the Atlas has this very, very strange 1.5 stage setup is because the engineers weren't sure if they'd be able to light an engine during flight. So they kind of made sure that all the engines would light at once at the beginning. Just going to interrupt myself here, actually. We're about to stage those lower engines. There they go. As you can see, separate perfectly, nothing exploded, jobs are good. And anyway, like I said, the engineers weren't sure if they'd be able to light an engine during flight, hence the need for this weird 1.5 stage setup. But of course, given the fact they weren't sure if they could light a brand new engine in flight, you can bet that they didn't think they'd be able to relight an already burned engine during a flight in order to circularize into orbit. Yes, remember how I said earlier that a lot of players get the flight profile wrong? This is why. Most players will do a standard gravity turn to get into orbit. They'll wait for their apoapsis to get to the desired height, cut the engines, coast up to apoapsis, fire the engines again to raise their periapsis above the Kármán line. However, this is not true to the Atlas flight profile. The engineers didn't know if they'd be able to relight rocket engines, so that's not even something they considered when designing the Atlas rocket. We have to get into orbit using just this one burn. As soon as we launch, we cannot cut the throttle until we've achieved a stable low Kerbin orbit, which is quite a difficult flight plan to try and do because it's completely counterintuitive and stupid to do in Kerbal Space Program. Don't do this flight plan unless you're doing this very specific mission recreation because it's very inefficient. But we're working with the pages of history here. What you want to do, you may have noticed I'm doing a very, very, very steep gravity turn. And that's because we're basically trying to combine our gravity turn and our apoapsis burn to raise our periapsis into one. And in order to do this, we need to do a very, very, very steep gravity turn. And the reason for this is because, as I'm sure you're all aware, achieving orbit is less about just going straight up and more about trying to pick up lots of horizontal speed. However, if we do a conventional gravity turn where we kind of combine our vertical ascent and our horizontal acceleration into one, what you end up with is your apoapsis is miles away from where you are, and your apoapsis gets to a point in space well before you yourself reach space, which at that point you would just cut the throttle and then do a circularization burn. But we can't do that. So we have to kind of make sure that our apoapsis never gets too far away from us and that we do the bulk of our horizontal acceleration when we're either about to reach the Kármán line or are in space ourselves. Obviously, we'll have to be finishing the burn whilst we're in space because we need our periapsis to be in space and we can't raise our periapsis to a point higher than where we are. Which is why at this moment you can see I'm pointing very, very steeply inward because we've now actually passed the Kármán line, but our apoapsis is, 80 kilometers-ish. We don't really want to raise that any further, so by pointing more radially in, we're focusing more of our energy onto raising our periapsis height. You can see the Kerbal Engineer readouts there. Our periapsis is rocketing forwards, but our apoapsis is actually decreasing, but it's not changing by too much, at least when you compare to how much our periapsis is changing. And that's how you kind of do it. And then as we kind of reach orbital velocity, we can start pointing our nose a little bit closer to the prograde marker so we can finish our circularization whilst in space, which is about to happen. There it is. We're in a pretty eccentric orbit there, but that's still quite accurate to the Mercury Atlas program. John Glenn, first astronaut to achieve orbit, was in a very eccentric orbit like this one. I am very eccentric here, and I did cheat a little bit during the ascent because I did play around with the throttle of our engines because I realized my apoapsis was slipping away from me a little bit. But overall, I'd say that's a pretty accurate ascent profile for my Mercury Atlas mission. But if you want to try and improve on this, you can try and do it without altering your throttle. I, quite frankly, couldn't be bothered after all the headache I'd gone through trying to get the Atlas rocket to work. I'm not showing you take one of this mission. It took a few different design iterations to get that weird 1.5 stage to work correctly. And by the time it finally did work, I'm like, you know what? I just want to get to space. So let's just go to space. And now I'm satisfied with the fact I've got to space. Let's deorbit. I made sure Jebediah completed 4 orbits because that is the number of orbits that was completed by John Glenn. At least he completed 4 orbits in my memory. In actual fact, he completed 3 orbits on his first mission. I just misremembered this when doing the flight afterwards. And I was watching the footage. I'm like, I did 4 orbits there, not 3. But whatever. I'm one-upping NASA, okay? I've just speedrun the Mercury program, okay? I just did the whole Mercury program in just over 17 minutes, okay? NASA spent years wasting their time with boilerplate tests, the Big Joe rocket. You don't need to, NASA. 3 rockets, mate. It's all you need. Few minutes, just whack them all together, back to back to back, and that's just how you do it. So SLS is delayed. Just come to me, come to Lowne Aerospace. We can bash something out for you in 20 minutes. I've always said, Kerbal Space Program has given me all of the knowledge that I need to build a fully functional moon rocket all by myself using nothing more than a few lines of copper wiring, some stainless steel plating, and a fully fueled Saturn V moon rocket. That part is probably the most important component to my plan to single-handedly build a moon-capable rocket. But that's not where we're going in this video, the moon landing programs. That's the Apollo follow program. And as I said, I want to kind of go through the various stages of the space race, kind of breaking it down into the individual programs. So the Mercury program is what we've just done. So now it's time to move on to Project Gemini. Now, there's actually a Gemini rocket in stock Kerbal Space Program, provided you have the Making History DLC. Here it is. The Gemini capsule itself looks pretty good. The forward nose is a bit janky, and the service module is a perfect cylinder rather than slightly tapered, but it looks close enough for me to use with minimal modification. However, I am less satisfied with the Titan rocket itself. It's a fair attempt, but the aesthetics don't look quite right to my eye. The first thing I want to improve upon is the stock vessel's lack of a nice shiny fuselage. The Titan II launch vehicle sported two reflective stainless steel sections along its fuselage, so I am recreating the appearance of these sections by using silver fairing pieces. Now, it's not possible to get the dimensions perfect, but I'd say I got things pretty close. My other issue with the stock Gemini rocket was that the first stage for the stock vessel looks a little bit too short and stumpy. The real Titan II rocket looks a little bit taller. Now, I haven't measured this or figured out the exact right scale, so I could be off here, but to my eye, this looks slightly more correctly proportioned. The 1.875 meter tanks otherwise have the correct color scheme for Titan II's paint job, so I can use those for the bottom part of the first stage. And finally, we can cap it off with this engine here, the Bobcat, which is directly modelled after the real LR87 engine used by the Titan, so we haven't got to craft any funky custom shapes like we had to when building the bizarre first stage of the Atlas rocket last week. When the Atlas rocket was being developed, engineers weren't confident that they'd be able to start a second stage rocket engine in flight, so all the engines were ignited at liftoff with a central sustainer engine that would burn for the entire flight, and two side-mounted engines that would boost the rocket for just over 2 minutes before being jettisoned, but only the engines and a bit of superstructure, I guess, none of the propellant tanks. It was quite a difficult setup to engineer in Kerbal Space Program, but thankfully this time around we could do things a bit more conventionally. The Titan rocket is a much more standard setup of a first stage stacked in tandem below the second stage with in-flight ignition of the second stage engine. So here we are, conducting our Gemini launch. Now, I stated earlier that with this series I am trying to fulfill all of the major objectives of each program in far fewer launches than NASA did, because we're speedrunning this. So this flight isn't going to be a recreation of any specific Gemini flight, but rather one that'll meet the objectives of several. In total, there were 12 Gemini flights. Gemini 1 and 2 were uncrewed test flights, so we could just skip through those, since at Lowne Aerospace our superior technology does not require testing. So moving on to Gemini 3, this was a simple mission to orbit, so we could do that with this flight. Tick, that's pretty much done. We'll cover the other objectives as we go along. What I can address quickly is my somewhat odd-looking ascent profile. We're going for a very steep ascent with the first stage at first, because as well as trying to recreate the overall look of Gemini, I'm also trying to recreate the flight profile of the rocket. And the Titan rocket stages can almost be thought of as being like solid rocket motors. They burned at full thrust for the entire flight and were only lit once, which means we're going to have to get into orbit using just this one giant burn from the launch pad. No throttle cuts and no separate circularization burns for us, although of course the burn is split across the two rocket stages. This means that during ascent we have to balance out our acceleration and our course, such that when we arrive at our apogee we'll be in the final stages of raising our periapsis. I find the easiest way to do this is to go with a nice steep ascent profile, and once our apoapsis is at the very edge of space, we can start pointing downward toward the radial invector to ensure that more of our energy is going toward raising our periapsis rather than continuing to raise our apoapsis. Eventually, this will cause apogee to start falling, so just before it drops too far, we can start nosing up and burning more towards the prograde vector, and once we've passed apogee, we can start to point upwards toward the radial out vector to continue raising our periapsis without having too great an effect on our apoapsis. I know, kind of a wordy explanation and difficult for me to articulate very well, but given the visual medium of YouTube videos, you could just watch all of that happening on screen for an idea of how I managed it. And I don't mean to inflate my own gazebo here, but I think I did pretty well. There's a little bit of fuel remaining, but oh well, we don't need it, so we can just detach. Of course, in real life, the lower stage would eventually see its orbit decay and crash back to Earth. Unfortunately, that won't happen in Kerbal Space Program, so maybe at the end of this series I'll do a big deep space cleanup where we just catch all the debris and send it hurtling back down to the ground. But that's a story for another time, I guess. Now, one of the most notable things that was conducted by the Gemini program was how the Gemini spacecraft docked to an Agena target vehicle to familiarize NASA with performing orbital rendezvous, a vital capability to have ahead of any moon landing mission. However, I thought I'd spice things up, and instead of going for a Gemini Agena dock, yawn, we'd instead go for a Gemini dock, which fulfills the mission objectives of Gemini 6A and 7, which involved the rendezvous of 2 Gemini vehicles after the original plan to rendezvous with an Agena vehicle was scrubbed after the Agena failed to launch. We're going a bit above and beyond here though. Rather than have the 2 vehicles just get really close, we're going to dock the 2 together, obliterating the frankly pathetic effort from NASA. I've also made a couple of other changes to this particular Gemini rocket that you may have spotted, because I wanted this vehicle to meet the objectives of both Gemini 5, which demonstrated the use of fuel cells for electrical power, and I also added a science experiment to the exterior of the capsule so that we can fulfill the objectives of Gemini 12, prove that an astronaut can do useful work while on EVA without life-threatening exhaustion. Gemini 12's EVA was performed by Buzz Aldrin, who took some photographs and retrieved a micrometeorite collector, so our Kerbal is going to perform science in the form of reading and taking data from our temperature experiment. Now, I know I mentioned for our first ascent that I was going to try and recreate the actual flight profile of the Titan II booster, and just have one giant burn, split across 2 stages of course, to get to low Earth orbit, or in this case, low Kerbin orbit, of course. But for the second flight, I'm like, you know what? I've already showcased my ability to get to orbit in one big burn, and quite frankly, I don't want this video to drag. So we're just going to do a very standard Kerbal Space Program gravity turn and descent, where we just do a gravity turn and then cut the engines and then do a circularization burn in low Kerbin orbit. At the end of the day, this series is not only about me showcasing, you know, very famous historic space flights, but also allowing me to one-up those noobs at NASA and showcasing my superior abilities as a rocket scientist. So here at Lowne Aerospace, we developed an engine for the Titan II booster that can be reignited infinite number of times. That's the excuse I'm going with. No compromises here. That's just it. That's my tale. So yeah, I think I just kind of gave up during that sentence, didn't I? I don't really know what to talk about now, because this is just a fairly standard Kerbal thing. It's nothing really specific to the Gemini missions, other than, of course, we're using a Gemini vehicle. We're just doing a fairly standard Kerbal Space Program docking procedure now. I guess if I was going to do this realistically, we would minimize the number of burns we would do, because in real life, engines can't just be reignited an infinite number of times yet, like you can do in Kerbal Space Program, provided, of course, you still have fuel. Before any actuallys or whatever, comment below. I know there are, you know, qualifiers to that statement, but regardless, like generally in Kerbal Space Program, engines are 100% reliable and 100% reignitable. You can light them as many times as you want, which I guess is kind of a justification for why they're so big and heavy. It's one of the reasons why if you use the mod Real Solar System, or any mod that kind of upscales Kerbin, you just can't use the stock parts at all, because the actual amount of fuel the fuel tanks store is barely anywhere close to what their real-life counterparts can store, and the engines weigh an absolute ton. But I'm willing to let the engine thing slide, because Kerbal Space Program engines are so overpowered compared to real life. Like, okay, they're not very, like, literally very powerful, but they can be reignited an unlimited number of times. They're 100% reliable. They would just be a great asset to human space program if NASA decides to, invest in Kerbal Space Program engines. NASA, Just abandon the SLS. Just start building the Mammoth and the Vector, the Terrier, the Poodle, etc. Think how much good we could achieve if humanity just had infinitely reignitable and 100% reliable rocket engines. One can dream, I guess. Anyway, here we are docking our 2 Gemini spacecraft together, and as I was saying that, we have now docked the 2 Gemini spacecraft together. So let's go on an EVA. And by doing our EVA, we fulfilled an achievement of Gemini 4, which included the first extravehicular activity, or just EVA, by an American. No need to spend a full 22 minutes out there like Ed White did. This is a speedrun after all. And we did it untethered, which isn't something NASA achieved until the space shuttle, unless you count the Apollo 11 moonwalk, of course. And Bob Kerman there admiring the world's first Gemini dock. What an achievement. Although, I guess I did say that in this video I was going to try and aim to recreate all of the key milestones of Gemini, and I guess it wouldn't be a completely comprehensive video if I didn't involve the Agena target vehicle in some way, so let's go ahead and quickly get an Agena target vehicle up there as well, and just dock with it to showcase that we can still follow some of the plans that NASA did, despite my very aberrant deviations from the course of history. Now, much like the Gemini Titan rocket, there is in fact a stock rocket for the Agena target vehicle and its Atlas launch vehicle, but I don't really know what's going on with it. The lower stage looks absolutely nothing like an Atlas rocket. In fact, it looks closer to the lower stage of the Titan rocket, so not really sure what was going on with the stock rocket. Luckily, I still have the Atlas booster that we built last episode in this little series, so I just cut and paste the sub-assembly across, and we can just launch this with a better looking Atlas vehicle. The Agena vehicle looked close enough to my eye. It's not perfect, but it's fine, really. I mean, we've already proven that we could go above and beyond NASA's achievements with docking Gemini and Gemini together, so really it doesn't matter a great deal if our Agena vehicle is not spot on with NASA's. Much like the previous Gemini mission we just did, I'm not going to bother trying to do a completely accurate ascent profile for this rocket by just having one giant burn, admittedly split across 2 stages to reach orbit. I'm just going to get to space in the easiest way possible, which is just doing a standard Kerbal Space Program gravity turn, cutting our engines once our apoapsis reaches a desirable height, and then just coasting all the way to apoapsis, and then doing a prograde burn to circularize. Just easier, and it's not really the point of this segment of the video. And there we have it. Our first stage ascent burn is all done. We can just stage away and let that Atlas booster crash back down somewhere to the surface of Kerbin. And, well, I don't really know what else there is to add, to be honest. There is one thing I need to do, and that is stage away that upper nose cone to expose the docking port on the Agena target vehicle so that the Gemini spacecraft can indeed dock with it. I think once I complete making this little maneuver node, we can go ahead and activate that stage. I'm just being very finicky with the separation node there. Okay, and let's just coast along to our burn and stage. There we are. And there is our Agena target vehicle. I know blink and you miss it, but you'll have plenty of opportunities to see it over the next few minutes as we perform our Gemini encounter. And you know what? You guys have already seen me do a rendezvous before in this video when I docked the 2 Gemini spacecraft together, so I don't think there's any real benefit to showing you another encounter, so I'm just going to crossfade across to the point where we reached the Gemini vehicle. So there we are. I skipped quite a bit ahead here to the point where our Gemini is going to try and slow itself down and dock with the Agena, because at the end of the day, the Agena was the target vehicle, not the Gemini, so I didn't get too close a separation so that we can do a bit of orbital maneuvering using the Gemini capsule. And hey, I'm playing the footage back very fast, you can see what's happening. I'm not going to try and do my trademarked Lowne lazy method of docking, in which we just use auto SAS for both vessels so that they just hold a lock on each other's docking ports and they line up really, really nicely. I'm just going to dock using the Gemini and leave the Agena as a dead weight target vehicle, as it would have been in the Gemini program in real life. And here we are performing this historic moment in Lowne Aerospace's space race speedrun. Bit of a wobble at the end. The magnets took control of the 2 vehicles, but there we are. We are docked to the Agena target vehicle. And in real life, the Agena, you know, if left in space, would have eventually decayed and returned to the surface of Earth, burning up in the atmosphere, actually, not to the surface. But this is Kerbal Space Program, where orbital decay is not a thing, so I thought I would one-up NASA once again and remove the junk from space and deorbit both the Gemini and Agena at the same time. Of course, I will separate the 2 when we enter the atmosphere, as demonstrated there, and then we can just stage the service module away from the Gemini, and that was perfect separation there. Don't worry about it, guys. It's fine. I'm not quite sure why the service module glitched out like that when I staged. At the end of the day, I didn't design that part of the rocket. This is part of the stock Gemini rocket that comes with Kerbal Space Program. You would have thought they'd have checked their staging of all things, but I guess perhaps they didn't, or perhaps just something glitched out. I don't know. Luckily, we can try that again with our second Gemini module, which is still in low Kerbin orbit because its mission has not yet been completed. So once this capsule has splashed down, we can go ahead and return to that one and continue on with our Gemini phase of the space race speedrun. And that is splashdown. Thank you so much for flying Lowne Aerospace with us today, Jebediah Kerman and Bill Kerman. Let's return to their colleagues in space. We're now going to remain in space for 15 days, which will beat Gemini 7's 14 days in orbit. Gemini 7 spent a grueling 14 days in space to determine that the capsule could support astronauts, and indeed the astronauts were able to live in space for 2 weeks. Of course, the other thing we need to be able to prove we can do in order to survive long-term spaceflight is prove that we can generate electricity using a fuel cell. So that's what we're going to do as well in this part of the mission. So I'm just going to activate this fuel cell here and watch it recharge our batteries. I've never actually used a fuel cell in Kerbal Space Program before, so I wasn't sure how you're supposed to use it. You might press out on the fuel cell, unless there's another way of doing it. And then I ran down our batteries again by quickly spamming the SAS wheels just to deplete the batteries and showcase that we can once again recharge the batteries after they've already been recharged. Am I going to do that in just a second? There we are. So we have proven that you can recharge batteries using a fuel cell. And with that, that was the final big objective I wanted to meet in this video. And I think it's fair to say that we've pretty much hit every major milestone and achievement that the Gemini program made. If you think I've missed any, then do of course let me know. But I think that's a pretty comprehensive win for Lowne Aerospace in our quest to speed run Gemini. The only thing we need to do now is deorbit ourselves, and I guess we can have another go at decoupling that service module. But overall, I think that's a very successful attempt at a Gemini speedrun. The first Gemini flight was in April 1964, and the last was in November 1966, so I think it's fair to say that I've crushed this record in our Lowne Aerospace speedrun. This isn't the last Gemini video I want to make though, as there were a lot of plans for extended use of the Gemini spacecraft after the program had met all of its objectives. Plans were proposed for an advanced Gemini vehicle, a big Gemini vehicle that would serve a range of missions, including a lunar landing. So that's an interesting topic, I think, to visit another time, but that time is not now. Now it's time, ladies and gentlemen, for the big one, the one you've all been waiting for, Project Apollo. Now, for those unfamiliar with this series so far, what I'm going to attempt is end NASA's whole career, complete Project Apollo, and meet every major milestone it set in as few launches as possible. Now, we'll begin where we began when we began running the beginnings of when NASA began their first manned program, Project Mercury. The first phase of Project Mercury was to test and validate the capsule's launch escape system, which of course is a vital component of the spacecraft in order to ensure our astronauts don't meet an explosive demise. And the Apollo program had a similar test platform to validate its launch escape system. Now, I know real rocket scientists and intellectuals would just use an entire Saturn V and spam the stage button after launch to test this, but apparently, in the real world, there's a thing called budgets and common sense. So I guess instead of that, we'll recreate the rocket that NASA used to test the Apollo launch escape system, the Little Joe 2, a small rocket comprised of 6 solid rocket engines that would launch a boilerplate or dummy capsule into the skies before the launch escape system would fire and, hopefully, pull the spacecraft to safety. Now, not only in this series am I trying to meet every milestone set by every major program, but I'm also trying to subtly one-up each milestone set by the program. And in this case, I am so confident in the technology of Lowne Aerospace that I don't think we need to have a dummy capsule on the Little Joe 2. I think we can have 3 of our astronauts sit in the command pod as we conduct this critical test to validate the capsule's safety. And here we are on the launch pad, and I've now switched to live commentary. So I don't know how this is going to go. I hope it's going to go okay, but let's see how we go. So Jebediah, Bill, and Bob are ready in the capsule in 3, 2, 1. Let's go and test our launch escape system for the first time with crew on board. So really there's a lot at stake here. So the Little Joe 2 seems to be going okay. I'd say this is a pretty good rocket as far as airborne machines go, flying machines go, whatever, it doesn't matter. All we really need to do is get on a trajectory that will take us to land in the sea. I guess now would be a good time to deploy, so let's hit the abort action group in 3, 2, 1. Oof. Don't know about you, but I think that was an absolutely beautiful detachment from the lower stages there. So let's just detach that launch escape tower and deploy the parachutes. And it's cleared. It's fine. See, that's how well I designed this craft. And now we can just time warp down to splashdown. But I would say, all things considered, that's a pretty successful test of the launch escape system. And not only did we not use a pathetic boilerplate spacecraft, but we tested it with a crewed module, and all crew survived miraculously. Thank goodness. Our space program would have probably been shut down if they hadn't, but they did, so it's fine. And we can touch down in the water in 3, 2, 1. There it is. My live commentary leaves a bit to be desired, but I think I hit all the important points. Let's now move back to time-lapse Matt, and we can talk about our next launch. Now, for the next launch, I was a little bit undecided about which rocket to go with. I mean, obviously in Apollo, we want to use the Saturn V, and I've just shown you I wanted to use the Little Joe 2. But in the interim, there's 2 other rockets that featured quite prominently in the Apollo program, and that is the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B. Now, the difference between these 2 rockets is fairly minimal. There's not much difference between the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B, other than really the Saturn 1B being the upgrade over the Saturn I. I know there's a lot of nuanced differences that I could go into, but functionally and crucially aesthetically, there is very little difference between the 2 rockets. So I decided to just skip the Saturn I and move straight to the Saturn 1B, because after all, in this series, I'm trying to one-up NASA. And NASA, why did you go with the Saturn I? There's so many upgrades you could have gone with, as you demonstrated by building the Saturn 1B. So I'm just going to go straight to the Saturn 1B. We got it right the first time here at Lowne Aerospace Space Race Speedrun. Now, the Saturn 1B was probably the most intimidating rocket to try and recreate in Kerbal Space Program, and I'm not going to pretend that I've done a perfect recreation of the rocket, but I'd say I did a pretty good job. The reason I say it was a very intimidating rocket to design, it was certainly the most tricky to emulate out of the 3 Apollo rockets I'm creating in this video, is because the lower stage, or the first stage I should say, was actually made of lots of separate tanks. They were separate redstone tanks, I believe, and you get this, it's got a really unique look to it that's incidentally very difficult to recreate in Kerbal Space Program. So in the end, I kind of achieved the look by using the Mark 1 diameter fuel tanks to kind of create the general aesthetic of the Saturn 1B. And as for the actual payload of the Saturn 1B, I was a little bit torn about what to do, because there were so many Saturn 1B launches that really I wasn't quite sure. But in the end, I decided to go with Apollo 5, which was the uncrewed orbital test of the lunar module, aka the lunar lander. Now, the lunar lander used for Apollo 5 was, it wasn't really the full thing. It didn't have landing legs, for example. It was a very stripped down article. It was a pure test of the basic systems of the vehicle. So I thought, let's one-up NASA again, and instead of just using like a half-finished lunar lander, I'll just use the lunar lander that I plan to take with us when we do our actual Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 recreation. So we've got to quickly cut away from the Saturn 1B build and quickly construct the lunar lander. And I kind of janked it together using the structural paneling pieces. I don't think it's a perfect shape, but then the actual lunar lander shape is quite difficult to replicate in Kerbal Space Program, at least in stock. There are some amazing mods, but I feel like this is a good enough approximation of the shape that we need. I'm going to paint all of these panels gold except 2 on the diagonals, because not all of the paneling on the lunar lander was gold, I think. I think a couple of panels were like painted black. Well, not painted black, but you know what I mean, coloured. They weren't coloured gold, basically. Looking at it now, it does look a bit... It does look a bit rough around the edges, but you know what? It's fine. No, and don't worry, I'm not actually going to add 8 landing legs to it. I'm just using 8 so I can use the symmetry of the octagon shape of the lander's body, and then we can just remove 4 of the legs from the symmetry and delete them as required. And with the landing legs added, that's pretty much the lander done. Fairly simple construct. I did consider recreating the Apollo moon rover and storing that on one of the corner parts of the lander, but I couldn't get it to fit. The actual Apollo rover wheels that come with the Making History DLC, they don't really fit into an appropriately sized lander, at least if you want to emulate the actual storage and deployment mode of the real Apollo rover. Like, you can make one fit, but it's a real tight squeeze, and I ended up coming up with a better solution, which I won't spoil for you, but I think you're gonna like it. Anyway, with the completion of the construction of the lunar lander, our build for the Saturn 1B, at least in its Apollo 5 configuration, is complete. So there it is on the launch pad, and I'd say it looks fairly close to the genuine article, and then we can blast off using our 8 engines. Now, I'm using the vector engines because there's no, I don't think at least, that there is an in-game equivalent to the engines of the Saturn 1B. But what I have done is I've disabled the gimbal of the central 4 and only enabled the gimbal of the peripheral 4, because that was what the real Saturn V, I said Saturn 5 again, that's what the real Saturn 1B did. It only had gimbal on the 4 outer engines. I mean, despite having gimbal, it also had 8 fins, so we should have a fairly stable rocket. Ironically, this rocket really wanted to list side to side on ascent, and speaking of the ascent, I'm going for a fairly steep profile, because while our thrust weight ratio at the first stage is excellent, the thrust weight ratio of the upper stage leaves a lot to be desired. So I wanted to try and build up as much altitude as possible using the first stage, so that we'd have loads of time to pick up the necessary horizontal speed to achieve orbit with our much slower upper stage. And I guess I could have made it faster by draining some of its fuel, because it has way too much delta V really for what it needs to have, but yeah, I don't know, it adds to the lift capability of my Saturn 1B, so it can be used for other missions. And I think there's probably something ironic in me using the space shuttle engines to power my replica of the Saturn 1B, given that the space shuttle pretty much replaced the Saturn 1B as NASA's workhorse vehicle. Obviously the Saturn V was their flagship, but Saturn 1B was their hauler that would put crew in space and do the mission. The space shuttle kind of replaced the Saturn 1B, so kind of a twisted act to power the Saturn 1B using its cause of death as its means of propulsion. And here I'm not being that faithful to the real mission. I'm actually deorbiting the lower stage so it doesn't get left stuck in orbit. But in doing so, we've kind of met an objective set by Apollo 4, which is to test the ability to relight the J2 engine after it had already been lit once. Now, admittedly, Apollo 4 was a Saturn V, not a Saturn 1B, but it's all irrelevant, really. I've proven that this engine can be relit, and I've proven that we can throttle and light the lander engine, and all the systems seem to work. The landing legs deploy, the ladder deploys, and we can EVA from the hatch. That's right! I have once again dabbed on NASA. And I've not only tested that the lander works, but I've also tested and validated the fact that it can sustain a Kerbal, and they can survive in space on board the lander, which of course does leave the question of how we're going to get Jebediah back to the surface of Kerbin. But it's Jebediah Kerman, all right? He's going to be fine. First of all, though, we do need to test the ascent engine there, which once again, works beautifully, and we can throttle it, and it works really well. And now we need to get Jeb back home. So obviously the lunar lander doesn't have parachutes, because why would it? But what we can do is we can just have Jeb stay in the cabin to survive the worst of the re-entry heat, and then we can just bail him out, and we can use his personal parachute to get down to the surface. But during this part of the flight, we can test the lunar lander engine, and we can confirm that it does work when exposed to the extreme heat of re-entry, which is not something that we would need, but it's good to know. I started freaking out a bit there because I couldn't get Jebediah to EVA, because I didn't realize that if you've got physics time warp on, you can't EVA. I don't know how it's taken me so long to realize that that's a thing, but there you go. I learned something in this mission. So really, this being a test flight to Apollo, it taught me something. So in a way, we can call that another success for my Saturn 1B replica. Come on, Jeb. Splashdown anytime today. There we go. Beautiful. And now that we have tested the launch escape system, we've tested the lunar lander, I think we're pretty much ready to build the rocket that you all came here for, the mighty Saturn V, so that we can actually perform a landing on the Mun. And here I am building it here. So the first thing I'm doing is building the little capsule and building a shroud for the launch escape system. The nose cone on top of the capsule isn't great. It's not as sleek as the real thing, but I wanted to have the 3 parachutes on top of the capsule on landing, like the real Apollo capsule. And when you try and put the parachutes inside that nose cone adapter, which I'm like 99% sure that adapter piece was designed to do, the parachutes won't deploy. Even if you like remove the shroud, it's a glitch. It's a known glitch with that part. I don't know if Squad have fixed it. It's literally been like 2 years since I've tested this, but I didn't want to take any chances. So the shroud there that the docking port is attached to is going to be empty, and the parachutes are just underneath it, and they're sort of separated by a decoupler. So that's kind of why the nose of the Apollo command module is a bit weird looking. And then it's time to build the rest of the rocket, not before I add fuel to the to the command module. That would be a very critical part of the rocket's design. I think we can all agree. Anyway, let's get to building the rest of the rockets. There's the 3rd stage there with its single J2 engine that's going to get us from low Kerbin orbit to the Mun. Then we're building the 2nd stage with its 5 J2 engines. There they all are there. And of course, we've got to build the massive 1st stage with its 5 F1 engines. And a few I's to dot, T's to cross, like adding batteries and fuel cells and stuff. But other than that, the rocket is done. I know it's not perfect. There's always going to be people that are just better at recreating things than me. But I think, for all intents and purposes, I'd say this is a pretty good approximation of the Saturn V. And here we are, ready to launch. 3, 2, 1. I feel like I had to just stop talking there to really bask in the might of that incredibly powerful 1st stage of the rocket there. We can start speeding up the footage a bit as we make our way to space. So the Saturn V in Kerbal Space Program is it's way too powerful for what it needs to do. In fact, the actual stock vessel that just comes with the game, the Saturn V in the stock doesn't have a 2nd stage. It's just 2 stages to orbit rather than 3, because it's very, very easy to get to Kerbin orbit, and it's very difficult by comparison to get to Earth orbit. So my Saturn V does a lot better with its stages than the real Saturn V. So we're actually very, very high up in the atmosphere when it comes to deploying the 1st stage, and then this 2nd stage is pretty much just going to get us all the way to orbit. I'm not going to complete our orbit with this stage for the sake of accuracy, but we could quite easily I think we could probably get all the way to the Mun using the Delta V in this stage if I didn't detach it early and waste all that fuel for the sake of realism. So there you are, NASA, again. You know, your Saturn V could only just get to the Mun. Get to the Moon. Mine can probably go like to Eve or Venus, maybe. I don't know, I haven't crunched the numbers. But what I'm saying, NASA, is that like I'm just better at rocket science than you, and that's really the take home I want to really hammer into everyone right now, is that SpaceX needs to hire me. I would really like to be the guy that does all the talking on the Starlink launches and all the other launches, do some commentary. I think that'd be a pretty sweet gig. So SpaceX, if this does not prove that I am 100% fluent in the nuances of rocket science and rocket design, then quite frankly, I don't know what will. I always enjoy making comments like this, because then I can read the comment section and see all of the people who don't realize I'm being tongue-in-cheek right now. They get really angry in the comments. Just to be clear, guys, I'm very well aware that Kerbal Space Program is not a one-to-one simulation of actual rocket science. Don't worry. But you know, SpaceX, I can do the whiskey tasting in the high bay bar. That would be a good job for me. Anyway, you might be wondering why my orbit is so high, and that's because the parking orbit in the real Apollo mission was 190 kilometers. So I decided to just do that because I had the Delta V. I know in terms of scaling, this is not the correct scale now. We are much higher above Kerbin compared to how high Apollo was above Earth, but you know, I just felt like I had to somehow justify my excess Delta V. Anyway, on to the next phase of the mission. I've already plotted the maneuver node, so it's too late for me to talk about plotting the maneuver node, but you can see I've kind of put myself on a free return trajectory. So at this point, if my engine was to fail, the spacecraft would just coast around the Mun, and then it would just return to Kerbin and re-enter, and everything would be fine. So I did a free return trajectory. Now it comes to plucking the lander from that Saturn V upper stage. So we are just going to grab onto it in 3, 2, 1. Beautiful docking. And then we can right-click the middle docking board. This is really weird staging. I probably should have just had it where the command module was directly attached to the top of the lander rather than have both bits of the craft be attached to the third stage. But I just like making things complicated for myself, I guess. And speaking of making things complicated for myself, I put myself on a collision course, I think, to the Mun when I pulled the lunar lander away from the Saturn V upper stage. I ended up changing our orbit a bit too much, and I had to do a last-minute radial outburn in order to stop us from smashing into the lunar surface. And as speaking of the lunar surface, it is approaching us now, so we can perform our retrograde burn to get into a parking orbit. This is not going to be our final orbit. The real Apollo mission did one burn at where I just did a burn, but then it did a secondary burn at perigee to lower itself down to its final orbit, which we've now done. So there's not much else left to do other than transfer our two brave Kerbinauts into the lander can to perform Kerbal Kind's first ever landing on the surface of the Mun. So we've got Jebediah there piloting the vessel, and Bob Kerman, who is our scientist. He's going to grab some surface samples, do a bit of science stuff, whatever it is that scientists do, and a good time will be had by all. So just did a quick deorbit burn, time warped down to when I got close to the surface. Probably a little bit too late. It was a bit trigger happy with the time warp button there, so I did a quick radial outburn just to stop ourselves from smashing into the side of that crater, and then once we were clear, I then coasted down a little bit more conservatively. But now our surface velocity is pretty low, so we're now safe to perform our touchdown. I'm going to try and touch down below 5 meters per second, which, beautiful. Textbook landing, and there we are! Jebediah and Bob Kerman have landed on the surface of the Mun, and in doing so, we have met Apollo 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17's primary objective. And of course, we've one-upped NASA there because Apollo 13 didn't meet this objective. There was an explosion. You guys have all seen the film, right? And know of the historic, famous event of Apollo 13. We didn't have that problem, so it was fine. And there we are, we can plant our NASA flag. Now, I mentioned earlier that Apollo 15, 16, and 17 all brought rovers with them, which of course, we've not done. So people are going to be like, aha, Matt, you said you were trying to one-up NASA, but you have not, because NASA brought a car to the surface of the Mun. But remember, I said earlier that I came up with a solution that I thought that you guys would like. And here it is. I sent a Lowne Aerospace big boy roving base to the surface of the Mun to meet our brave Kerbinauts. I think this is probably a superior rover to the pathetic one that NASA sent. It was rubbish. It was like a folding rover. It didn't really have anything going for it. Like it didn't have a swimming pool in it, which this one does. This one's got a bar in it. It's got loads of space, it's got loads of cabins, it's got balconies, it's got loads of solar panels, radio equipment, there's a cinema inside it, there's even a little crazy golf course, 18 holes. Really good rover. So I think this is much better than NASA's. Bob Kerman is going to just take it for a quick joyride around the surface of the Mun, and Jebediah can watch, I suppose. Now my plan was to do a quick... I didn't want to spend too long on the rover segment because watching people drive rovers in Kerbal Space Program, at least for me, I don't find it the most entertaining. So I've sped the footage way up, and we can just do a quick whip around to the edge of this crater, and then we can return to Jebediah Kerman. However, at that point, ladies and gentlemen, things went a little bit Apollo 13. This mission was not completely without some failure, but hey, I'm just going to say that I'm recreating a failure. I've engineered in a mission failure to emulate Apollo 13. So this is actually part of the plan, but my plan was to ghost ride the whip past Jebediah Kerman, and then Bob could leap off the rover and jetpack down to the lander. But then he just sort of smacked his head on the top of that lab module and then was completely unresponsive. Like at this point, I was like smashing the keyboard, pressing every button, trying to get some sort of response from Bob, but it wasn't working. So I had to just then switch back to the rover and make it come to a stop, which is far more boring, but it was the only thing I could do if I wanted to save Bob. And I would quite like to bring my two Kerbinauts back to the surface of Kerbin to tell their tale to all. And here they are. So we got him free. It was fine. We could just jetpack him down to... I think he left his surface sample and EVA report inside the rover, come to think of it. But I guess he was scared. He was worried. Heat of the moment. These things happen. I'm sure at some point on Lowne Aerospace, we will return to the Mun. I'm guessing. But anyway, time will tell, and right now there are much more pressing matters at hand. For example, right now we've got to get back to the orbiting command module. So the first thing I've done is shut down that lower Terrier engine. We can stage, and the craft will separate, and that spark engine will immediately fire. And the upper stage was incredibly easy to build because that cabin there that obviously is meant to be a replica of the Apollo lunar lander, it already has all the fuel, electric, monopropellant, RCS thrusters. So the only thing I needed to add was a spark engine, and it worked really, really well. It has just shy of 1,000 meters per second of delta V, which is way more than enough that you need for the Mun. So that is a pretty safe configuration if you're wanting to recreate an Apollo lander yourself, and maybe you play on console and can't download craft files from the description, which I don't even know I'm going to include a craft file because I don't think I've been including craft files in this series so far. I can't even remember now. It's been I didn't even remember what I had for breakfast today, to be honest. So I don't know what I've been doing, but I've been talking about the build, and you guys have seen the build, so maybe I won't. I shouldn't be talking about this because I might just include one in the description. Wow, this is exciting. What's it going to be? You should look at the description and then you can write a comment and tell me, even though by then I will know for sure. Really, guys, I'm just stalling for time until we get to the docking itself, which I guess is well underway, so now I can just talk about that. I'm going to perform the docking with the command module, which is faithful to the real Apollo missions. I'm not going to do the, air quotes, Lowne lazy method of docking in which we get both craft to contribute towards the docking. I'm just going to dock using the command module. I'm going to just leave the lander can as a dead weight, so we have to do all of the docking using the Apollo command and service module. And kind of tricky, we don't actually have that much monopropellant. I probably should have stuffed some extra monopropellant tanks into that service module, but I didn't. So we've only got the monopropellant that comes with the, I guess, the Apollo style. I really should learn the names of parts in Kerbal Space Program, given that, like, I play this game semi-professionally. I still just call it the Apollo style command pod. Is it the Mark III cargo? No, Mark III crew cabin? Is that what they call it? Crew cabin. That's how basic my I'm pretty sure the game calls all the crewed modules crew cabins, except the passenger ones, where it's a mixture of just hitchhiker storage or crew. Anyway, irrelevant, isn't it? Again, but look at that, we've docked through that mess of a commentary, so we can get Jebediah and Bob back into the Apollo command module, and then we can start plotting a course back home. Not before we detach the lunar lander, which of course will now be left to crash into the surface of the Mun. It won't, it will stay in orbit forever, but in real life it crashed into the surface of the Moon, and now we can plot a maneuver node to get back to Kerbin. The only thing really I was trying to focus on was making sure we land in the ocean, which really, there was no fancy calculations involved with this. I just went for any old periapsis in Kerbin's atmosphere and hoped for the best, and I lucked out. We landed in the ocean, just barely. So this counted as a splashdown, but there isn't really a secret method that I know of to guarantee your splashdown in the ocean. It's just a case of going for it, making a quick save, and if it doesn't work, make a quick load. I really struggled to get an ocean landing in Gemini and Mercury, really ironically, in those videos, and I say ironically because I was only coming from low Kerbin orbit, but the first time I tried doing the Apollo landing, in which we came all the way from the Mun, I got an ocean landing immediately. So I guess that's just life, isn't it? That's just life in a nutshell. What a deep topic. Speaking of deep, the ocean is deep, and we are landing in the... That was terrible. I'm not... You know what, guys? This has been a long video, and it's like... I'm very tired. It's like 9:30 in the evening for me. My room is boiling hot, because we've had a heat wave in the UK, and I've got no air conditioning, and I can't have my fan running, because then you'll get picked up by the microphone, and really, it's just... I'm there. I've reached my limit. I'm just struggling on to get the video finished. But I guess, luckily, as luck would have it, the end is in sight. Literally, there is the water. We have splashed down, and thus we have absolutely smashed the Apollo program in a mere 3 launches. We validated the launch escape system with our Little Joe 2. We tested the lunar module using the Saturn V, and of course then we just did the entire Mun landing. No dress rehearsals or anything like that. We just went ahead and did it because that's what we do here at Lowne Aerospace. We are the speedrun masters. NASA hang your head in shame. Anyway, for the next episode, I'm going to rewind the clocks and look at the Soviet manned programs. I'll say no more than that at the moment. On screen, though, there are some names scrolling on the right. They're my Patreon supporters who really make all of this content possible. So big props to you guys. Thank you so much for donating. If you want to join their ranks, you can do so by clicking the Patreon card on screen. You can also help contribute to the channel by joining, which is there's a button that says join underneath the video. You get a little badge next to your name so you can show off to everyone, I guess. There's also a link on screen. There's more than one link on screen, actually. I don't know why I didn't use the plural of links. And wow, now I've run out of time.